Good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Matthew Jane, and I am the Learning and Engagement Manager for the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we'll hear from Janelle Molony. Today's program focuses on the immigration experiences and adventures of Iowan Sarah Rousseau. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in just a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Jess Runlet, is watching that feature and prepare a list of questions for our speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note we may not be able to get to all the questions. And now I'm very happy to introduce our presenter for today. Janelle Molony is an award-winning author and journalist, a member of the Western Writers of America and Oregon-California Trails Association. She's a verified descendant of the Rousseau family and a publisher of the incredible story, The 1864 Diary of Mrs. Sarah Jane Rousseau. She hosts the Wyoming Historical Society's YouTube series, Women of Wyoming Then and Now. Her latest release, Immigrant Tales of the Platte River Raids, recently ranked #1 on Amazon for biographies of the Civil War. And now I'm happy to turn over to Janelle to begin the webinar.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Matthew, and the State Historical Society, and to everyone that joined us today. I'm really glad that you're here today. And as he explained, yes, I am the third great-granddaughter of Miss Sarah Jane Rousseau and the author editor of multiple books and articles about her and her experience on the Oregon Trail with the Earp family, who are now Wild West celebrities, but they weren't back then. At the end of this presentation, I'll share with you where you can get those books and get more information about what I do. But like you, I'm actually excited to talk about Sarah today and her overland journey. So let's get right into that. So in today's presentation, there's kind of a three-part story that we're going to hear. First, we're going to learn about Sarah Jane Rousseau's background, her cultural upbringing, her education, and some of her exploits in America as an American pioneer. Then we'll talk a little bit about her award-winning trail diary, which has since been published. And when we get into that, we're going to kind of shift directions to talk about her observations of Wyatt Earp's father and watching him lead them or lose his sense of leadership on the journey. So that would be part 3 of today's presentation. So let's go ahead and get to it. If you have any questions that pop up during the conversation, please put them in the comments so you don't have to remember them and hold on to them. And I'm sure Jess will get to them. So actually, let me stay right there. Before we get into all of the backstory, I want to give you a quick rundown of Sarah Rousseau, a little resume, if you will. So she was born in 1815 in London, well, Northern England. She grew up in London, England. She was raised right on the heels of the Industrial Revolution. She's a member of the landed gentry, so she has rights and privileges of the ton. She was raised in the comforts of the upper class. Privately educated in London. She was college educated in America. And over the course of her life, she became a pioneer in 3 states in America. Her travel diary from 1864 has now been recognized as equivalent in value to the 1947 diary of Anne Frank. It is recommended reading for students and teachers who are studying westward immigration. It's also currently competing for a Pulitzer Prize. And before I forget, it's important to remember that she ends up on this journey having debilitating rheumatism, and she is wheelchair bound, which makes her story a little bit more unique, I think, because I've never read an Oregon Trail story about someone who was physically handicapped and taking this journey in a wheelchair. So that's very unique to her. So to get her story started off right, I want to get us into the mindset and understanding of who she is and how she was brought up. She is a Victorian woman. Granted, she wasn't in England when Victoria was in reign, but I'll explain. So Sarah Jane Daglish, as her maiden name was, her story begins during the unstable reign of Mad King George, as they called him, and was made popular in the Broadway play Hamilton. So when the king's mental illness caused him to deteriorate and the courts took him out of view, his wife, Queen Charlotte, and his son, King George IV, took on a substitution leadership role, and that was called the Regency era. So it's a little slice of the Georgian era history where the son and the wife were kind of handling things, but they didn't actually have full power. So once he died, once King George III died, his son took over and was kind of a loose leader. Some people maybe call him a puppet to the minister, cabinet of ministers, and he just didn't really fit the role very well. Well, he died with no heirs. So his brother took over and he died with no heirs. So here we end up with Queen Victoria, or Princess Victoria. She's the first bloodline heir to the throne, and she's only 4 years younger than Miss Sarah Jane Daglish in London. And she is, at this point, she's called the hope of the nation. Everyone is thrilled about this cute little girl. And even the girls, if you imagine Taylor Swift now, they're obsessed with her. She's the princess who is destined to become a queen. Anything she does, all the ladies will do. Anything she says, all the ladies will do. Her fashion, she became an icon. So this is the woman that Sarah Jane Daglish grew up wanting to be. She wanted to be like the princess. This was her queen, even though Queen Victoria was not old enough to take reign until later in life. So I want to introduce that to you. And if anyone has ever seen the popular Netflix show Bridgerton, you're also getting some visuals for the lifestyle that Sarah Jane Daglish was raised in, of getting ready for those debutante balls, looking for a suitor, wearing all the empire waist dresses, and of course, whatever Victoria did, she would do. Also, Jane Austen novels were out at this time, so she would have been highly influenced by the writing of Jane Austen. All right, so when Sarah Jane was growing up in the Regency era, at this time, industries such as manufacturing, fashion, and architecture were blooming, and there was a major breakdown in society because of the Industrial Revolution. So those who worked in manual labor lost their jobs. Those who didn't made wealth off of the backs of these machines. So there was a huge class divide, and they ended up on the better end of it. Her dad was a tailor at that time. So there was no machinery that could do what he did for his private clientele. And back then, being a tailor, as my cousin Stephen Daglish would say, he lives on the other side of the pond, tailoring was a thing. They were comfortable. They were well off. He had clients that he not only dressed them to the nines, but he protected their secrets and made them look their best even when they weren't their worst. Okay, so we have that kind of very special reputation. The family had several tailors, bootmakers. This was a whole thing. And even Sarah and her sister were educated in being seamstresses, and perhaps in their future, they would have continued into that industry. So at this time, they are landed gentry, meaning they have land elsewhere that they're receiving an additional income for, on top of this substantial amount that Mr. William Daglish is making as a tailor. I can't even imagine it. But they are in the ton. This is the upper class. And even without a title, their reputation was as much as wealth, was as much as a title. And so this is their environment they're growing up in. At this point, every lad and every lady, young lad, was expected to adhere to a bewildering and unwritten collection of rules, as quoted from a recent article by Catherine Curzon about the Regency era in History Extra. And Sarah and her sister Mary grew up having to follow these rules. They were expected to do number one, keep themselves away from any kind of scandal. Number two, find themselves a wealthy husband. Number three, become the most beautiful or most talented woman that they could possibly be. So that was it. Do these three things and you will succeed and continue to climb the social ladder. So when they moved to London was when the girls were toddlers. They actually grew up in Northumberland, which is northern England, and moved down when they were little to Brunswick Square. And Brunswick Square at this time was absolutely brand new. It was built the year that Sarah was born. And people who lived here were like the elite. So maybe not celebrities, but military generals. We had surgeons, poets, composers. So upper class, upper crust people could afford to live in these beautiful townhomes. In one of Jane Austen's books, Emma, there's a character who talks about living there, and she says her home is so very superior to most others. So again, where's all this money coming from? Tailoring and rental income. Wow, right? While they were there, they were afforded a private education with tutors in the house, so the girls did not have to go to a common school or even to a boarding school. Again, we're talking money. And while they were taking lessons at the house, they received piano lessons, or back then pianoforte lessons, from Mr. Ferdinand Ries, who is shown here in the black and white sketch. Now, I didn't realize this, but Ferdinand Ries is not very well known here in America. He's actually Ludwig van Beethoven's right-hand man. He was his student for over 20 years and became his personal secretary. And because of the intimate relationship he had with Mr. Beethoven, he became the very first Beethoven biographer in 1838. So he's got the talent, he's got the prowess. He is actually the one who founded the Philharmonic in London. He's a piano virtuoso. He's a composer of multiple symphonies. And so he has his own reputation besides being Beethoven's guy, right? So the girls are able to take lessons from Ferdinand, and I cannot even fathom what those lessons cost. If he was able to command whatever price he put on them, they could pay it. And that's talking 2 students, and they took lessons for 7 years with him, starting from the ages of 3 and 4 years old. Now, of course, on top of all of this extraordinary talent, they are getting an education that is appropriate for a delicate female mind in London. And I will make a divide between the European education and the American education they received. Now, in London, girls learned just enough to ensure they'd be sparkling and lively hostesses or conversationalists. They learned surface level humanities and sciences, not very much math. And of course, we never want to offend a male counterpart by having an intellectual thought or be able to argue with them on a point. So their education in that respect was a little bit capped. Now, when they graduate from their schooling, they are expecting to go to those debutante balls with their white gloves and their feathers in their hats and their hair and find a suitor, marry well, and that was it. But in 1824, their mother dies, and their father, who's very busy, cannot raise his daughters for those kinds of expectations. So he has to rethink a new plan for how to take care of his girls. And he starts hearing these stories of land opportunities in the United States of America. Now, I'm going to pause there because I don't want to glamorize this point at all. This is not wonderful land opportunities. These are the forced evictions of Native Americans from lands west of a certain point. And so it's not all sunshine and daisies there. So anyways, in his perspective, he wants, as a landowner, to increase his holdings. And this sounds great. So he says, okay, this is a way for us to start over and we can make ourselves new here in America. So in 1830, they get on a sailing boat, take 6 weeks, go across the ocean. And at the ages of 8 and 11, the girls are thinking like, oh my gosh, there goes my future. There goes my prince. There goes my debutante balls. All of those things that are in their heads have to go out the window, and they better learn how to become American women real quick. Well, they land in New York City. And I want to point out the flag here. It only has 24 stars because at that point, we only have 24 states in our union. So they land in New York City, and the girls end up going to their very first public school. At this point, it is at the First Presbyterian Church in New Rochelle, which is northern New York City, and that's shown on the bottom left. They had at that point a new ladies' seminary program attached to the church, and while they were there, they would get an education that was at that time equivalent to a college education of a male, which, yeah, right. I'm going to tell you what they studied there based on advertisements for other schools at the time. So in 1830, there was another school advertising in the New York Evening Post, and its advertisement reads that the school is designed to elevate the standard of female education, and that academical studies, embracing all the literary, scientific, and ornamental branches, will be adapted to young ladies to give them an education of equal value to what is gained by the other sex in our high schools and colleges. So we're still dealing with some watered down discussions. However, the American education system puts more emphasis on, as they call it, academical studies, or core subjects is what we would call them now. And those ornamental subjects like fine arts and music were actually not provided automatically. Those were extracurricular, and you would have to pay extra tuition if you wanted those, similar to today. So now we have a little shift in their education. They're learning a little bit more of what their male counterparts would be learning. And when the sisters graduate, again, we have a cultural clash here. They're expecting, based on the way they were raised, to now marry someone and go be a pretty little housewife. And that was it, right? And become a socialite. But again, we're in America now. And they are 15 and 17. And they're well educated. They have incredible talents. They're both quite beautiful. And yet they have to figure out what to do. They have to get a job because there's no other option for them. So in New York City, they begin using their talents to teach piano. And as they advertise, it is clear to see in their advertisements that they end up having a very liberal and flattering patronage. And I have a feeling, like Ferdinand Ries, they can charge whatever they want to charge. So they advertise themselves as the Mrs. Daglishes. And I would say they really did have some flattering patronage, including like the uppity ups mayors and the children of doctors and the children of generals and stuff. So they had really a nice clientele. So between 1834 and 37, the girls and their father moved to Detroit, Michigan. Michigan had just become a state at that point, and because of another forced eviction, i.e. an acquisition of land, their father is really interested in checking out these land opportunities. So he moves the girls there, and they get one teaching position that they share at the Detroit Female Seminary. And if they weren't teaching, they were also giving private lessons at their home in Detroit. So they were really working it. They were establishing their reputations and developing a thing for themselves with no male providing for them at that point. They were probably paying the bills more than their father was. So in the summer of 1837, while Sarah was teaching, she received 2 male callers at the school, one of which was a medical student from Kentucky, and that was James Rousseau. And the other was his cousin, Lovell H. Rousseau, better known as Brevet General Lovell Harrison Rousseau, who was on the Republican ticket to become a vice president on Lincoln's reelection year. He lost. Woo-woo, right? But as the story goes, James captured Sarah's heart and they fell in love immediately. But he had work to do because he and his cousin were in Michigan as land surveyors to now divide and parcel out and measure that new land they acquired. And from what I understand, this was really difficult work. At this point, they're surveying the land above Saginaw Bay, which is mostly swampland. And they would have to hold their satchels of sketch paper, hold their telescopes, or as they called them, marine glasses, which is on the top right, the stands and the compass, hold it over their heads so they could slog through the swamps to try and get around. And this was an incredible hardship, as James wrote in a letter when he was doing that. That fall, he wrote this letter to his supervisor saying that even with these hardships and fatigues, this land was, and in this land that was groaning under millions of mosquitoes, it would be impossible for him to finish the job in the 4 months that they gave him. Agreed. So as a solution, the government thought, okay, here, we'll fix this problem. We're going to put the project on hold, wait until the dead of winter, so then the swamp, theoretically, would be frozen. And then these land surveyors can just walk along top of the frozen water and finish their job, right? So this is grueling work, and they're out in the middle of nowhere doing their jobs. And James really made it clear in another letter that he did not get paid enough to do this kind of work, and he would never do this ever again. Well, while he's doing that, he's still courting Miss Sarah Jane Daglish, who marries a judge, and they move to Saginaw Bay, and they finally tie the knot in 1839 when James finishes his contract. So he marries her and they go back to his hometown in Kentucky, where his family has a very large plantation. The family had been there for many years, pioneer settlers, large property, well known. So she's feeling kind of comfortable getting away from the mosquitoes and like, okay, this place is nice, right? Well, he finishes up his medical school, starts a practice for himself as a country physician, which means he rides around on horseback to visit his patients. And at one point, his granddaughter, Evelyn, wrote about how he was racing to go get to a patient. And when he got to his patient who was deathly ill, his horse actually dropped dead. And so I can only imagine. I hope that the patient fared better than his horse did on that day. Well, in 1843, the Rousseaus ended up ferrying up the Mississippi River, and they ended up in Burlington, Iowa, where they stayed for a little while. Suddenly, we see in the 1844 paper that's shown here, there's an advertisement for new land or a new purchase of land that needs to be surveyed over in the western part of the state. At this point, it's central. So even though Dr. Rousseau swore off land surveying for good after that experience in Michigan, he's like, well, I can do that, right? So he moves into Marion County. And at that point, in 1843, Marion County had again done a forced eviction of the Fox and the Sac tribes, and they had to move west of the Red Rock line, which is shown in the little dotted line. So they had to get out by 1843. 1844, they make this call, and he's there by 1845, basically alone. No one else is allowed to be there in Marion County at all unless they were previously living there, which meant a miner, a trapper, or a fur trader, and that's it. So their nearest neighbor was, or nearest human contact even, was a mile away at that point. So he's surveying out there, and at that point, it was a major downgrade for Miss Sarah Rousseau. She thought, hey, married a doctor. He has a huge property in Kentucky, lots of land, big family, well-known reputation. And now he's bringing me here to the virgin elm grove forest, which that means there's no roads, there's no well for water, there is nothing for her to live in. So probably for a while they lived in a tent, or maybe he built a log cabin until they were able to build something more appropriate for her comforts. Again, we are always talking about a woman who is expected to be treated a certain way, who is expected to live a certain lifestyle. And this is where she ended up. So this was a major downgrade for her for a while. Well, in the process of doing his land surveying work, Mr. Rousseau was able to pick the choicest land for himself to purchase. So he picked up 240 acres, which now make up almost the entire city of Busey, Iowa. If you think of that, Busey, Iowa, all of that city was his actual residence that he lived on. Pretty incredible. So while Dr. Rousseau continued to do his land surveying work, he still was a physician, and he was also a postman in Elm Grove or Busey. And once he finished his government land contract, there was an opportunity to continue surveying, but at that point it would be just laying out roads and streets and deciding parcels for houses. Nowadays we would call that civil engineering, but back then that wasn't a thing. Some of the towns or cities he laid out were Knoxville, Pella, Marysville, Busey, Wheeling, which doesn't exist anymore, and Rousseau, which he didn't name by himself. Actually, someone requested it to be named after him, which is a cool honor. However, the town of Rousseau is now completely submerged under Lake Red Rock. You might be able to see the top of a roof from an old building, but that's about it. So while they're there in Marion County for the next 20 years, boy, oh boy, did this place not get big. It did not turn into another New York City or a London or a Detroit for that matter. But Sarah Jane Rousseau made the best of it, and she made friends, and she became a socialite, probably feeling a little bit like a big fish in a small pond. She may have enjoyed taking tea and discussing fine arts with the wife of Dominique Schulte. So Marie Schulte would have been of a similar upbringing and able to speak French, and they would have had a good connection there. Well, things were going fine for the Rousseaus until the chilly winters of Iowa really became too much for her with her arthritis. And at some point, she became completely wheelchair bound. And this was something, though at that point, Dr. Rousseau had been a physician for over 20 years, he couldn't cure. So he said, okay, we need to go with the climate cure. We've got to move to where it's warm and sunny and dry, because I don't know what else to do for my wife. And side note, her father died with rheumatism. And so she watched that. She watched it not go so well. So this was not going to be repeated. They were going to get to California or get to the coast. So with them on this journey, or preparing for this journey, are the other residents of Marion County, including the son of John Hamilton. Now, John Hamilton is shown in the top right corner. There's three faces. He's the far right. And we're not talking about him. We're talking about his son. But I've never seen a picture of his son, so I only have this one. Well, the son of John Hamilton was one of Pella's earliest settlers, even before the Hollanders that arrived. In fact, they sold their land to the Hollanders and then ended up moving to a parcel just south of the Rousseaus, which is now named Hamilton, Iowa. They are credited with planting the first apple orchard, and they're part of the organizing of the first Methodist meetings in Pella. And then when they moved south, they also became well known for, or their town became well known for, being the place for whiskey drinking and gambling. And I guess they just took that phrase going south a little too far. Anyways, John Hamilton Jr. was a law clerk, and his wife was not only a newlywed, but also pregnant on their journey. Also coming along with them is the very large family of well-known pioneers, Reverend Israel and Lucy Curtis. And they, I would say, are the most famous, not the Earps, they are the most famous people on this wagon journey. Like the Hamiltons, they arrived in Pella years before the Dutch. Israel was a lawyer for a while, and his son and he had a law firm called Curtis and Curtis. The family is well known for their contributions to Pella government and economic development, including founding Central College and establishing the first Baptist church in Pella. And eventually Israel became a district attorney for the county, and this was a huge honor for him. In 1863, he was nominated to be state senator. Wow, right? But for him, this was not good because he had sons who were of age to be conscripted. I would say drafted, but the Confederacy did drafts. The Union did conscriptions. So I believe he had already paid for a deferral or a substitution for one of his sons at this point, which would have cost him an arm and a leg. And he liked to keep money in his own pocket. So if he wanted to keep his sons out of the Civil War activities, he would have to leave the country. And so he did. He packed up the largest party on the wagon train journey with 12 children and grandchildren and an entire herd of cattle. And some accounts call the wagon train the Curtis Company, probably because they were the most well-known, most popular, and most wealthy of the group. And of course, we have the last people joining on this train are the now legendary Wild West family of the Earp family. But again, back then, they were unpopular. And Mr. Nicholas Earp was keeping a low profile in Iowa because he had some outstanding debts in another state he used to live in. And I don't think he wanted them to know what he was up to or where he lived now. So he was keeping that hush-hush. His family settled in Pella in the early 50s, left for a bit and came back. He had a small farm in the area, and he also worked as provost marshal for the Union. They kind of begged him to do that, even though he was quite done with all things war, all things military. Oh, well, he did it anyways. And he did improve his reputation because, again, he had some financial situations he was in, and he was previously a bootlegger, but he cleaned up his reputation during his time as a provost marshal, and he was nominated to become a venerable sheriff in 1863, which is also a testament to his character being developed. But also at this time, Iowa government had announced that they were going to extend full citizenship rights to Black freedmen as part of the emancipation effort. Well, Nicholas Earp wasn't a fan of that. So he decided it was time for him to leave this area. And of course, with him are 5 of his 9 children, including 16-year-old Wyatt Earp. Now, Wyatt, Morgan, and Warren, if you don't know, we're all part of this shooting at OK Corral here where I live in Tombstone. Well, I don't live in Tombstone, Arizona, but in Tombstone, Arizona. And so they have their own special reputation. According to an account by William Jesse Curtis, Israel's son, the boys acted as guards for the wagon train. Now, I can only imagine that would be Jim, who was 23, Wyatt, who was 16, maybe Morgan, who's 13, maybe. So we're really narrowing it down there. And Jim on the left at this point had just been mustered out of the military, being fully injured in one of his shoulders. According to his disability paperwork, it was a useless arm and he would never work again. That's not true, but on paper, that's what he claimed. Fun fact, when Virgil, who's not shown here, Virgil Earp, was younger, he married one of the Dutch settlers' daughters. Her name was Magdalena Rysdom, and they eloped. And when she became pregnant with his son, and he was off in war, Nicholas Earp and Magdalena's father concocted a story, and they said that Virgil died at war. And so that way they can kind of annul the marriage and get her married off to another Dutch man. And this kind of got awkward on the trail because those Dutch families and her new husband and her daughter by Virgil Earp were on the trail at the same time. And as you read the different accounts of their journeys, you notice that they see each other in passing, but never stay together. There's always this gap between them in mileage. And I have to imagine that's not entirely coincidental because the Earps still have to maintain this charade that Virgil's dead and they can't talk about him, and they have to keep this up for a long while. So that's kind of fun. All right, so together these families call themselves the Pella Company. And at this point, Ms. Rousseau is going to be the first in her family to literally travel from sea to shining sea. Between those green lines on the screen are considered the Wild West. This is land that is maybe a territory or not so much. No governments in place. They are governed by whoever shoots the fastest. So, well, there's some military presence in some areas, but not others. So they're about to, as some people would say, run a gauntlet to get from Iowa to Southern California. And here's where we end up with another of Sarah's claims to fame. Besides her incredible talent for pianoforte and her incredible clientele that paid whatever she asked for it, she also had a remarkable command for storytelling. And this might actually go back to her following of Queen Victoria at that point, because Queen Victoria kept a diary of everything she did. So of course, Sarah Rousseau kept a diary of everything she did. And in her diary of this wagon train, of course, there are poison water holes, quicksand, rattlesnakes, the weather, the flowers, and other iconic sights. But there are some very significant events that elevate our understanding of the literary history of the West, the Mormon adventures, the Sioux Wars, and other very critical things that are happening at this time in terms of Civil War and just the development of the United States. So very, very incredible diary. But she wrote on July 14, "I sit in the wagon," because she's not walking, right? "And I see all that is going on." So this is her contribution to her wagon train. By the way, I was introduced to this diary by my uncle, who's seen here in blue, Richard Molony, and he has since passed. And we have images of the diary because of my colleague, Nicholas Cataldo, shown in the white shirt. So any image you see today is from him. So as the Pella Company departed, they ended up connecting with other Iowans of note, and their stories are captured and woven in to the Rousseaus and the Pella Company story in the book, Emigrant Tales of the Platte River Raids. So you'll get to see all of their journeys and how they intersect. But I wanted to bring up a few names. Isaac and Martha Rowe are coming from Grinnell. Martha Freeman is her maiden name. Her father was a known abolitionist and may have aided the Underground Railroads. We also have the Youngward and Rysdom, friends and family. These are Dutch parties leaving Pella, Iowa en masse. The Oliver family is coming from Melcher, Dallas. They are relatives of Daniel Boone. We have the Howard train coming from Marshalltown. The Howard train ends up associating with people who attempt to murder the next family. And then we also have the surviving members of the Browns of John Brown, who is the pre-Civil War abolitionist who was part of the 1859 Harper's Ferry siege. So the Howard train's associates end up trying to assassinate the family of John Brown while they're on the trail in 1864. It's all very exciting, and you can see that Sarah mentions the Browns in her diary as friends. They camped together on multiple occasions. She names them the New York train. So if you have her diary, look for those references to the New York train. And at this point, we're going to shift into her observations of Mr. Nicholas Earp as a wagon master. I don't know why exactly he was chosen to become the wagon master, although there's theories of, well, he was out this way for the Mexican-American War, so he's kind of familiar with the area. It could also have something to do with just being the one that was going to volunteer for it. Surely Israel Curtis wouldn't know where he's going. He studied other things in his life, and Dr. Rousseau had other obligations. Now, as a land surveyor, he would have been probably a good guide, but they needed someone that was a little scrappy, who had weapons, and who wasn't afraid to fight if they ended up in trouble. And I guess Nicholas Earp fit that bill. I would say that Sarah Rousseau was now becoming, in this event, the very first biographer about Nicholas Earp, and recording his character and his decision-making and his downfall. And I would say that because, as we can see in these numbers, he's actually her number 2 subject by name. And I don't mean general references to the wagon master or the captain or our leader. She names him 43 times. It's about half as much as her husband. It's more than her mentions of her children combined. So she is considering him to be a major character in her story. And so that's really important, that her diary really brings to life what's going on in the Earp family and his character development. Of course, she also had a special relationship with Virginia Earp, his wife, like many couple friends, where the wife is friends with the wife and the husband's friends with the other spouse. And it's a distinct relationship that they share, and that's also illustrated in the diary. So while they're in Nebraska, Nicholas Earp really tries to do his best as a wagon master. It doesn't always work out, but there's plenty of forgiveness. There's plenty of time for him to get better or worse at what he's doing, and no one's really on his case. So a few examples of this honeymoon phase that they all begin their journey in. So on June 15, Sarah writes that Mr. Earp got on horseback this morning to hunt us a good camping place. As he was coming back, he saw a big log burning in the distance, so he went to see what it was. Maybe someone had been camping there. And sure enough, someone had camped there and burned up a man. Whoa, there were his bones. So that is an example of Nicholas Earp trying his best to find a great camping place, and then, whoa, we were not expecting that. They camped a little bit further away from that. Next, June 17, Mr. Earp saw 2 antelopes this morning. They crossed the road in front of us. So Mr. Earp took aim and fired, wounding one of them. The wounded one got up and ran off. They followed him for a while, and he did not get up with them. Again, no one blaming Mr. Earp for this. Whoops, that's out of his control. Things are not going right, but it's still okay. So they continue. June 20, there was a sad accident occurred this morning. A young man was driving in another team close by us, went along with some others to get some wood on an island in the river and got drowned. The poor fellow had no relatives or friend along, so Mr. Earp tried to get his body out of the river, but the current was too swift. Again, another whoops. But from these entries, we might glean that either Nicholas has a bit of a hero complex, or he might be realizing that he's not as young and capable as he used to be. And as he's realizing that, he recognizes he also has an audience seeing this as well. In Wyoming, eastern Wyoming, which was then part of Idaho Territory still, Mr. Earp's courage is shaken. And his fears begin to get the best of him. So Sarah writes from Fort Laramie, July 8. We came pretty near having an unpleasant time last night. We have to keep close watch day and night over the stock. Mr. Earp went to see about the guards, and he found they had got up a dance. And he told them they must quit their dancing and be on duty. And one of the soldiers told him to mind his own business and ordered him off. Oh, it made him awful mad, and he was for killing. He used very profane language, and he could hardly be appeased. But he cooled down after a while, and all was quiet. So we definitely know that Mr. Earp is on edge now. And to be fair, these fears do get justified during the Platte River raids of July 12 to 14, where the Pella Company is attacked not once, but twice. And in this deadly engagement, actually no one is killed in their train, but folks are injured in the attacking party. They lose numerous horses. And at one point, Nicholas has a challenging experience where he has to elevate Wyatt Earp to guard his wife and children while he goes and chases after the attackers, knowing that if he dies, Wyatt's got to take over as the man of the house. So he did have to really confront that reality and establish that succession plan. And that's really hard for him at this point, I believe. More on that event, the Platte River Raids, again, is available in the nonfiction Emigrant Tales of the Platte River Raids. Well, on the 19th, Sarah is now observing that Mr. Earp is not recovering well. She observes after a short distance, we got somewhat of a fright. Some of the men thought they saw Indians coming. So we hurried and formed a corral while Mr. Earp went on the bluff to see if they were coming. He viewed all around and then beckoned us to go on. It was a false alarm. He's getting a little bit skittish. He doesn't feel safe anymore, and he's really struggling probably with post-traumatic stress. This is even more clear, July 21st, where Sarah writes, got ready for another start when we found out our cattle was gone, so hunted around for them, could see nothing. So we went down to the river with our horse team to water, leaving our big wagon back on the hill. Well, the doctor went back to see if all was right, and he returned pretty quick, saying something was the matter. But we could not tell what it was. So he took his gun, he went on the hill, and he wanted some of the men to follow him because Mr. Earp was running around at a great rate. It was not long before a good many were on horseback with their guns, and several soldiers went as fast as the horses would carry them. Well, the men returned in an hour or so, said there was nothing particular the matter. They said they saw 3 Indians at a distance. Well, when Mr. Earp retold this story to Virginia, he said he was surrounded by 15 Indians, and it really scared Miss Virginia. So we start to see he's really losing it. He's losing it on the trail. In Utah, Mr. Earp's leadership finally is stripped from him, and he's replaced by Mr. Richard Hatton, shown here in the black and white image with his wife, Elizabeth. After they come down through Salt Lake, they are now exhausted for the ordeals that they've had, and they need a place to rest and recuperate. Sarah says they stop in the Corn Creek settlement for 4 weeks. Mr. Earp says it was more like 9. But in the process, Mr. Earp's leadership starts to become weaker and weaker. He delegates decisions to, where are we going to camp tonight? Well, they're in a good place with good grass. And the Rousseaus are like, we need to stay right here. We have grass, we have water. And he's like, well, we'll just put it to a vote. And the vote ends up, other people want to go elsewhere, and they don't end up having the resources they need. But of course, that's still Mr. Earp's fault, because as a leader, he did not make sure that they would have what they needed. And they blame him for that, and they're angry, and there's division happening. No matter what happens, no matter if it's actually someone else's decision. Later on, July 31st, the train starts to divide up, and Mr. Earp got angry with the whole train because they passed him. And he took it as an insult, talked pretty hard to us. Some thought he had too much liquor. He used very profane language and told the whole train he would give up his captaincy unless they would adhere to the rules he gave. After being detained for an hour or more, very unpleasantly, we rolled on, all but one family. They left. Well, weeks later, it's actually Mr. Earp who leaves the Pella Company. He takes off on his own. This time, he's siding with the Curtises instead of the Rousseaus. And the Rousseaus find out that they're taken off on their own. No communication is shared, but they're seeing them leave through the doctor's marine glass or his telescope. And the doctor goes off on horseback and says, well, if Mr. Earp was going to act the rascal about going off with our property and going into the next town, well, then we're going to get a writ and we're going to get our property back in our own hands. And Mr. Curtis explained, well, we're just trying to get better grass and horses. But again, the train is divided and Mr. Earp is not keeping them united. Just a quick explanation on that one. Mr. Earp now needs the use of the Rousseau's horses and an oxen to pull his wagon. And in exchange, they now have some of their material in his wagon. So it's their horses pulling his stuff with a few of their items in it. And he is abusing and taking off with it and leaving. And they're like, those are our horses. What are you doing, dude? Well, the Pella Company catches up with Mr. Earp in Petersburg, Utah on Corn Creek, the settlement that you see here. At this point, he meets up with his old military buddy, Mr. Hatton, who served in the Mexican-American War with him. And they also end up staying here under the care of Pavant Ute Chief Kanash, who is shown on the far right. And at some point during their month-long stay to rest and recuperate, Nicholas Earp gets really suspicious of these Indians, that there's no reason to be. They are watching the stock. They're participating in social events. They have breakfast with the Rousseaus almost every single day. They're very friendly and accommodating. And I think that is due to their relationship with the Mormons there. They have a very positive relationship. But at that point, Nicholas Earp is fed up. He's not in California yet. No one's taking him seriously. Everything he does fails. And he's been attacked and abused and harassed so many times that he doesn't know up from down. So one of his cattle ends up having, or one of the party's cattle ends up having an arrow in its shoulder. Non-fatal, okay? And he gets so mad that he gets in the chief's face. And I'll read from that one. That one's pretty exciting. He got us nearly in trouble with his temper. He was swearing and cutting up. So he was really like swearing at the chief. Come on, really? Well, the chief got mad at him and swore back at him. I was very much afraid that they would get mad at us. The Indians kept coming until there was near a dozen, and there appeared to be a great danger of having a fuss with them. But fortunately, Mr. Hatton, Earp's friend, intervened, and he got Earp and Kanash to shake hands. And I think it went something like this. Don't worry, he's my buddy from the military. He's a little crazy in his mind. He's a Mormon, though. It's cool. He's with me. So Mr. Hatton smoothed things over. And with that last outburst and the danger, the very real danger that it put everyone's lives in, an intervention had to happen. 1 week later, the Messrs. Dr. Rousseau, Earp, Curtis, Hamilton, and Mr. Hatton had a meeting, reorganized the company for the remaining of the journey to California. And at that point, Mr. Hatton was elected the new captain. And Nicholas Earp never let anyone forget that. And I don't want to get too far into the end of the story. I'm going to actually skip that part. But at the end, the wagon train really breaks up. Like any good road trip, it starts off fun and you're listening to music and singing along. And at the end, you're like, I don't want to be here anymore. I just want out of the car. So they're broken up. The wagons are dispersing. They're passing each other like hopscotch. They're not together anymore. And the relationship between the Earps and the Rousseaus had really deteriorated to the point when Virginia Earp would not even make eye contact with Sarah anymore. And they had their own special relationship. Remember, even in her diary, she talks about she would visit other ladies, but she would go and spend her evening with. She would stay with Virginia. They had a thing. And not even Virginia would look at them anymore. Well, At the end of the journey, the Earps betray the Rousseaus in the San Bernardino Mountains. They leave him in a bind that's impossible, and they roll on without him. And that's a really hard story to tell, and I don't have time to tell it. And if I do, I'm going to ruin the the conclusion of the book. So if you want to know, pick up a copy for yourself. But the Rousseaus eventually settle in San Bernardino, and the Earps about 10 miles away in Redlands. And that diary that she wrote, man, oh man, it has been called the most dramatic pioneer exploit of all, among the most eloquent, a valuable account. Again, it's recommended reading for students. Modern reviewers are calling it a page turner. And if I didn't mention it before, I'll say it again. It is currently competing for a Pulitzer Prize for its contributions to the history of the United States. So I hope that that presentation today really whet your appetite to learn more and to see what other comments Sarah had to share about the Earps and what was going on their 1864 journey. If you have questions, we'll go through those now. Otherwise, if you want to reach out later, you can use the QR code here. And of course, Matthew and Jess will provide additional follow-up information in the presentation notes that will come out soon. So at this point, Jess, are there any questions?
Well, thank you, Janelle. That was quite the cliffhanger to end on. We have time for a couple questions. And as a reminder, if you have a question, please submit it through the Q&A feature on Zoom. Unfortunately, today we will not be able to get to all of the questions, but we have certainly had a super interesting and informative and entertaining program thus far. Janelle, we have a question about the women's school that the girls attended in New York City. Do you know if it had a teacher prep program?
I don't know about a teacher prep program there, but more information can be found by studying the Abbott Institute. ABBOTT is what it developed into.
Okay, thank you. And now we know that Sarah had some children since you are one of her descendants, but can you talk about her children and what the family was like?
She had 4 children. One stayed back in Iowa, and I believe this diary was meant to go to her to say, look, here's our adventure we took. Her second eldest daughter ended up marrying a wealthy topographer and train man in San Bernardino. And from there, we end up seeing that social climbing happening. Perhaps maybe Sarah's living vicariously through her daughter. And the family amassed wealth, marrying the Cave family, the topographer, and then eventually into the Molony family, who were also train engineers, conductors, and so forth. And so they had very large properties, a mansion at one point in the San Bernardino area. And so I think Sarah eventually did quite well for herself, living through her descendants and knowing that she was able to restore her place in society through that experience. They also had 2 young boys on the journey who, at that last moment when they were betrayed, they were the ages of, I think it's 8 and 10. Sarah Rousseau and her husband made the decision to send their 8 and 10-year-old boys on the 2 last horses that were able to walk from the San Bernardino Mountains up at the top to go find help. And these little boys, I remember my son when he was little, there's no way he'd navigate on a horse by himself in a land he's never been in. But they had no choice. So they sent their 2 little boys off to find help somewhere. And they did.
Oh, wow. Well, this will be our last question. And we're going to wrap up with a research question since this is the State Historical Society of Iowa. You have done a lot of research on this topic, and obviously Sarah's diary is probably your most informative and favorite source. But can you tell us a little bit about any other sources you have used to augment what you found in her diary?
Oh, most importantly would be a letter written by Mr. Nicholas Earp in April of 1865, where he recounts his version of events in the trip. And I think it's really important at this point to say that in the past, Sarah's writing has been questioned as maybe she was her husband's scribe, or what does she know? She's just a woman. And her writing has been exquisitely and precisely measured and calculated. I've measured her mileage forwards and backwards, and she's only 6 miles off over 2,000 miles. When she says she's somewhere, she is. When she says something happens, it does. And so what I found from that is Nicholas Earp's letter, written months after, not on the date of events, actually corroborates everything she said, point for point. In fact, there's even lines of dialogue that he writes of, I told them this, that are matching almost verbatim to what she says he said on the same day of. So that's one of my favorite sources, and there are copies available at the Central College.
Excellent, thank you. And with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Janelle Molony. We
Thank you
hope
so much.
everyone will sign up for the Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next Iowa History 101 webinar on April 11th. The topic will be A Colorful and Impressive Spectacle, 9 Decades of Tulip Time in Pella, Iowa. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.